All right, buckle up, Buttercup, because we're about to talk about a man who makes competitive eaters look like they have self-control. You think you've heard weird stories from history. You think you know what true hunger looks like. Let me introduce you to Tarrare, pronounced like Tarrare, a French dude from the 1700s who could eat literally anything and everything, and I mean everything. We're talking cats, dogs, snakes, lizards, eels, puppies, and yeah, we'll get to the really messed up stuff later. This isn't some cute, oh, he had a big appetite story. This is a medical horror show wrapped in a historical nightmare that'll make you grateful for your normal, boring digestive system. History class didn't tell you about this guy because teachers were too busy making you memorize dates of battles instead of teaching you about the man who ate a whole basket of apples in one sitting and then asked for more. But we're not your history teacher. We're here to give you the unfiltered, disgusting, absolutely bonkers truth. So who was Tarrare? Well, we don't even know his real name because Tarrare was just a nickname that basically meant all that noise or hubbub in French slang. Imagine being so weird that people don't even bother learning your actual name, they just call you the loud one, and it sticks forever. This dude was born somewhere around 1772 in Lyon, France, which at the time was just vibing before the French Revolution would come along and make everything infinitely worse for everyone. From the moment this kid could walk, people knew something was off. He could eat absolutely ungodly amounts of food. We're not talking, oh, he has a healthy appetite for a growing boy. We're talking this teenager could eat enough food to feed an entire family and still be hungry. His parents, bless their 18th century hearts, tried to deal with it for a while, but eventually they were like, yeah, we can't afford to feed you anymore, please leave. So they kicked him out as a teenager. Can you imagine? Your kid eats so much that you literally have to evict him from the family home because you're going bankrupt trying to keep him fed. That's not even the beginning of how weird this gets. Young homeless Tarrare is now wandering around France, hungry as always, and he figures out pretty quick that he can make money off his freakish ability. He joins up with a traveling group of performers, basically a bunch of con artists, thieves, and street performers doing the 18th century equivalent of a circus sideshow. His act was simple and absolutely disgusting. He would eat anything people gave him. Corks, stones, live animals, whatever. People would pay money to watch this skinny dude with a massive mouth literally consume things that should kill a normal person. He'd swallow whole apples without chewing. He'd eat live cats. Yeah, you heard that right, live cats. Just grabbed them and ate them while they were still moving. The crowd would go wild because apparently in the 1700s, entertainment options were limited and watching a guy eat a cat was considered a good time. He became kind of famous in these little traveling shows, but here's the thing, he was still always hungry. The food he ate during performances wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough. Now let's talk about what this dude looked like because it's important to the horror of this story. You'd think someone who eats constantly would be massive, right? Wrong. Tarrare was described as being abnormally thin, like ribs showing, gaunt face, the whole starving person aesthetic, which makes zero sense given that he was eating enough food for 10 people daily. But here's where it gets weird. His mouth was huge. Witnesses said when he opened it wide, you could see straight down his throat, and his mouth could stretch so wide he could hold a dozen eggs in there at once, or fit his entire fist inside with room to spare. His teeth were stained and disgusting. He constantly smelled like rotting meat, and I mean constantly. People said you could smell him coming from across the street. His body temperature was always weirdly hot, like he was constantly running a fever. He sweated profusely all the time, and the sweat smelled rancid. His eyes were bloodshot. His cheeks hung loose when he wasn't eating, like deflated balloons. Basically, imagine the least attractive human being possible and then make him smell like a dumpster fire, and you've got Tarrare. So the French Revolution kicks off in 1789, and by the 1790s, France is in absolute chaos. There's war everywhere, people are getting guillotined left and right, and the French Revolutionary Army needs soldiers. Tarrare, being a broke homeless weirdo who eats cats for money, figures the army might be a good gig. Steady meals, right? Wrong, so wrong. He joins up, and almost immediately the army realizes they have a problem. The military rations, which were already pretty terrible, weren't enough for this guy. He would eat his ration and then eat everyone else's rations. He'd steal food from other soldiers. He'd eat the medical supplies if they were edible. He'd go through the garbage and eat scraps, bones, stuff that had gone bad didn't matter. The army was like, okay, this is a problem, but they also found it kind of fascinating. Word got to the military doctors that they had this absolute freak of nature in their ranks who could consume anything. This is where it gets kind of insane. Some genius military officer had an idea. They're at war, right? They need to send secret messages across enemy lines. Carrier pigeons get shot down, messengers get captured. So what if, and hear me out here, what if they had a guy swallow the message, walk through enemy territory, and then poop out the message on the other side? Yes, this was a real plan. This was a real thing they thought was a good idea. They decided to test whether Tarrare could be a human carrier pigeon. The French military was so desperate and so bizarre that they genuinely thought, let's have this guy who smells like death and eats cats swallow our secret documents. The plan was that he'd swallow a wooden box containing the message, walk to wherever they needed the message to go, and then retrieve it naturally, if you know what I mean. They were literally planning to sort through this man's poop to get their military intelligence. This is real. This happened. This is actual documented history. So they did a test run. They had Tarrare swallow a wooden box with a document inside, and they sent him outside the French lines to deliver it to a French colonel on the other side. He succeeded, meaning yes, he pooped out the box and they got their message. The military was thrilled. They'd found their secret weapon. A human messenger who could swallow intelligence and poop it out behind enemy lines. But here's the problem, Tarrare was not subtle. Remember, he smelled like death, he was weird looking, he was clearly not a local wherever he went, and he didn't speak German, which was kind of important when you're trying to sneak through Prussian-controlled territory. On his first real mission, he got caught almost immediately. The Prussians were like, why does this weird French guy who smells horrible have a wooden box in his stomach? Well, they beat him, tortured him to make him confess, and when he finally pooped out the box, the message inside was just the French military testing him. It was basically a note saying, hey, if you get this message back to us, the experiment worked. The Prussians were furious. They thought they'd captured a spy with crucial intelligence, and instead they got a guy who ate a box as a test, and the box contained basically nothing. They threatened to hang him, but eventually they were just so disgusted and confused by him that they sent him back to France. The French military, realizing that their human carrier pigeon idea was spectacularly stupid, decided not to use him for spy work anymore. But the doctors were fascinated. They had a guy who could eat anything, who was always hungry, whose body worked in ways that made no medical sense, and they wanted to study him. So Tarrare became a medical curiosity. They brought him to a military hospital, and doctors started running experiments on him. Not nice experiments, not ethical experiments. This was the 1700s. Medical ethics were basically non-existent. They wanted to see what he could eat, how much he could eat, and what would happen. So they started feeding him absolutely insane things. They gave him a meal intended for 15 soldiers. He ate it in minutes and asked for more. They gave him live cats. He tore them apart with his teeth, ate everything except the skeleton, and seemed perfectly fine. They gave him puppies. Same thing, he ate them whole. They gave him snakes, lizards, eels, all alive. He just swallowed them down. The doctors were horrified and amazed. One doctor, a guy named Pierre-Francois Percy, wrote extensive notes about Tarrare, and those notes are where we get most of this information. Dr. Percy was both disgusted and intrigued. He noted that Tarrare's body was bizarrely proportioned. His stomach could distend massively after eating, like his whole abdomen would swell up like he was pregnant, and then it would shrink back down after he digested everything, which happened weirdly fast. The doctor said you could literally see the food moving through his digestive tract from the outside. His metabolism was insane. He was like a human garbage disposal, processing everything at superhuman speed and then immediately being hungry again. Dr. Percy started to suspect that Tarrare had some kind of medical condition, something wrong with his digestive system or his brain's satiety signals, but they didn't have the medical knowledge or technology to figure it out. The hospital staff tried to keep Tarrare fed, but it was impossible. He would sneak out of the hospital at night and go through the garbage behind butcher shops, eating entrails, rotting meat, anything he could find. He would fight with dogs over scraps in the street. The hospital workers started noticing that their medical supplies were going missing. Surgical tools had blood on them. Medicine bottles were empty. Then things got darker. Bodies started disappearing from the hospital morgue. This was a military hospital, so there were dead soldiers being stored there, and body parts, limbs amputated from surgery, were vanishing. Everyone suspected Tarrare, but nobody had caught him in the act. Yet, now here's where this story goes from weird medical case to absolute nightmare fuel. A 14-month-old baby went missing from the hospital. A toddler, gone, vanished from the children's ward. The hospital staff immediately suspected Tarrare. They searched for him and found him trying to sneak out of the hospital grounds. They didn't find the baby. They never found the baby. There was no proof, but everyone believed he'd eaten the child. The hospital staff was ready to form a mob and kill him. Dr. Percy, despite his scientific interest, was horrified and disgusted. He had Tarrare thrown out of the hospital immediately and warned him that if he ever came back, he'd be killed on sight. Tarrare disappeared into the streets of Paris. Nobody knows exactly what happened to him for the next few years, but we can guess. He was probably homeless again, probably eating whatever he could find, probably still hungry every single day of his miserable existence. Then, 4 years later, in 1798, he showed up at a hospital in Versailles. He was dying. He had severe tuberculosis, and his body was finally giving up. He was only 26 years old. The doctors at Versailles didn't know who he was at first, but as he got sicker, he started confessing his whole story. He told them about eating cats and dogs, about the military experiments, about his insatiable hunger. He died shortly after, and because doctors in the 1700s were morbidly curious, they decided to do an autopsy. What they found inside his body was the stuff of nightmares. His esophagus was abnormally wide, like a giant tunnel straight to his stomach. His stomach was enormous, taking up most of his abdominal cavity, and even though he'd been starving to death, it was stretched out and damaged. His liver was abnormally large and covered in lesions. His gallbladder was massive and swollen. His intestines were wide and covered in ulcers. Everything inside him was wrong, warped, like his entire digestive system had been designed by someone who'd never seen human anatomy before. The smell when they opened him up was so horrible that the doctors had to stop the autopsy multiple times to go outside and vomit. The smell of rot and decay was overwhelming, even though he'd only just died. They noted that his entire body, inside and out, was in an advanced state of putrefaction, like he'd been rotting from the inside for years. Which, honestly, he probably was. So what was wrong with Tarrare? What medical condition could explain this absolute nightmare of a human being? Modern doctors have speculated for years. Some think he had hyperthyroidism, which can cause an increased appetite and high metabolism, but that doesn't explain the anatomical abnormalities or his ability to eat literally anything without dying. Some think he had damage to his hypothalamus, the part of the brain that controls hunger signals, which could explain why he never felt full. Some think he had a severe psychological disorder, like pica, which causes people to eat non-food items, combined with polyphagia, which is insatiable hunger. Some have suggested he had a tumor or lesion in his brain affecting his appetite control. Others think he might have had a genetic disorder affecting his digestive enzymes, allowing him to break down things that would poison a normal person. The truth is, we'll never know. Medical science in the 1700s was basically, let's cut him open and see what's weird. And they didn't have the ability to do genetic testing, brain scans, hormone analysis, or any of the stuff we'd need to actually diagnose him. But here's what we do know. Tarrare was a real person. This isn't an urban legend or a tall tale that got exaggerated over time. Multiple doctors documented his case in medical journals. His autopsy report still exists. The military records of his attempted spy mission are in French archives. This actually happened. There was genuinely a guy in 18th century France who ate live animals, possibly ate human corpses, possibly ate a baby who smelled like death, who could stretch his mouth to inhuman proportions, and who died at 26 years old with a digestive system that looked like it belonged to an alien. That's real documented history. Let's talk about the baby thing for a second, because it's the most horrific part of this story and we need to address it. Was Tarrare actually a baby-eating monster, or was he just a sick man who got blamed for something he didn't do? We don't have definitive proof. The baby disappeared from the hospital while Tarrare was there. He was acting suspiciously and trying to leave, but nobody witnessed him taking or eating the child. There was no physical evidence, no remains found. In the 1700s, babies died all the time from disease, and hospitals were chaotic places. It's possible the child died of natural causes and the body was misplaced or stolen by someone else. It's also possible that the hospital staff, who already hated and feared Tarrare, just assumed he did it because of his reputation. But it's also possible, and we have to acknowledge this, that he did actually eat that baby. He had already eaten puppies, kittens, snakes, and corpse parts from the morgue. He was starving, desperate, and mentally unwell. If he was capable of eating a dead body, he might have been capable of eating a living child. We'll never know for sure, but the fact that it's even a possibility tells you how absolutely horrific this case is. The story of Tarrare raises some really uncomfortable questions about medical ethics, human dignity, and how we treat people with severe disabilities or disorders. The French military and the doctors didn't try to help him. They exploited him. They turned him into a sideshow, an experiment, a weapon. They fed him live animals for entertainment. They made him swallow boxes and poop them out for spy missions. They studied him like a lab rat instead of treating him like a human being with a medical condition that needed compassion and actual treatment. Yeah, he did some horrible things, and yeah, he was dangerous and maybe even evil by the end, but he started as a teenager who was just abnormally hungry, and society turned him into a monster. His parents abandoned him. Society made him perform degrading acts for money. The military used him for insane espionage plans. The doctors tortured him with experiments. Nobody ever tried to actually help him. They just used him until he became something inhuman, and then they threw him away to die. But also, let's be real, the dude maybe ate a baby. So, it's complicated. He was both a victim of his condition and a victim of how society treated people with conditions, but he was also potentially a child-murdering, corpse-eating nightmare person. History is messy. People are complicated. Tarrare was both pitiable and monstrous, and those things can exist in the same person at the same time. Here's what gets me about this story. Tarrare lived in constant agony. Imagine being hungry every single second of every single day of your entire life. Not, oh, I'm hungry, time for a snack, hungry. Not even, I'm starving, I haven't eaten all day, hungry. Imagine a hunger so intense, so overwhelming, so all-consuming that it drives you to eat live animals, to eat garbage, to eat things that aren't even food, and it still doesn't go away. You eat until your stomach is distended and swollen, and you're still hungry. You eat until you're in pain, and you're still hungry. You eat things that make you sick, and you're still hungry. That was Tarrare's entire existence. Every waking moment was controlled by an insatiable hunger that could never be satisfied no matter what he did. That sounds like hell. That sounds like the worst curse you could possibly inflict on a human being. And he lived like that for 26 years, until his body finally gave up. The doctors who studied him noted that he was aware of how abnormal he was. He knew people were disgusted by him. He knew he was a freak. He begged them to cure him. He wanted help. He wanted to be normal, but there was no cure. There was no treatment. Medical science in the 1700s couldn't even figure out what was wrong with him, let alone fix it. So he just had to live with it, being hungry and disgusting and feared by everyone, until he died young and rotting from the inside. What's wild is that Tarrare isn't even the only historical case of extreme polyphagia. There are other documented cases throughout history of people with insatiable appetites who could eat enormous amounts, though none quite as extreme or as horrifying as Tarrare. There was a guy named Charles Domery, a Polish soldier around the same time period, who also had an enormous appetite and ate weird stuff, including allegedly eating a human leg once. There are medieval accounts of people with bottomless stomachs, but Tarrare is the most famous, the most well-documented, and the most nightmare-inducing because of how extreme his case was and how detailed the medical records are. Modern medical science has a few theories about what might cause this kind of condition. Prader-Willi syndrome is a genetic disorder that causes insatiable hunger, but people with Prader-Willi become obese, and Tarrare was thin, so that doesn't fit. Brain tumors affecting the hypothalamus can cause extreme hunger, and that might explain some of his symptoms, but it doesn't explain the anatomical abnormalities found in his autopsy. Some researchers have suggested he might have had a severe case of hyperthyroidism combined with some kind of digestive malabsorption issue, meaning his body was burning calories insanely fast, but also not properly absorbing nutrients, leaving him in a constant state of starvation even while eating massive amounts. That would explain the hunger, the thinness, the high body temperature, and the sweating. But it still doesn't explain how he could eat things like stones and corks without dying, or how his mouth and esophagus were so anatomically different from a normal human's. There's also speculation that he might have had some kind of rare genetic mutation we've never seen before or since, something that caused his entire digestive system to develop abnormally. Maybe he had a combination of multiple disorders that created a perfect storm of medical horror. We'll never know because we can't exactly dig up his body and run a DNA test. Well, we could, but I don't think anyone wants to open that can of worms. Or should I say, open that coffin of rotting, corpse-eating man-worms. The legacy of Tarrare is weird. He's become this footnote in medical history, this bizarre case study that doctors still talk about in medical schools when discussing unusual disorders. He shows up in books about strange historical figures. He's all over the internet as one of those weird historical facts you won't believe are true stories. There have been discussions about making movies or TV shows about him, though I can't imagine how you'd make that anything other than body horror. He's famous for being a freak, which is kind of sad, but also he maybe ate a baby, so is it that sad? I'm conflicted. What really bothers me is that we'll never know if Tarrare could have been helped with modern medicine. If he'd been born in 2024 instead of 1772, would doctors have been able to diagnose and treat whatever was wrong with him? Could surgery have fixed his digestive system? Could medication have regulated his hunger? Could therapy have addressed whatever psychological issues he had? Or was his condition so extreme, so unusual, that even modern medicine would be stumped? We'll never know. But it's worth thinking about how many people throughout history suffered from medical conditions that seemed like supernatural curses, but were actually just biological disorders that nobody understood yet. The thing about Tarrare's story is that it's both fascinating and deeply disturbing. It's one of those historical cases that makes you grateful you weren't born in the 1700s, when medical science was basically, here, eat this mercury and see if it helps. And treatment for unusual conditions was, let's poke him with sticks and see what happens. But it's also a reminder that human bodies can go wrong in ways that seem impossible, that seem like they shouldn't be real. Tarrare's body broke every rule of normal human biology. He was a walking medical impossibility, and he suffered for it every day of his short, miserable life. So what's the moral of this story? Is there a lesson to be learned from the tale of Tarrare, the man who ate everything? I don't know, maybe it's don't eat cats. That seems like a good takeaway. Maybe it's modern medicine is actually pretty great, even when it's frustrating. Maybe it's humans are capable of surviving in the most bizarre and horrible circumstances. Or maybe it's just history is full of nightmare fuel and you should be glad you weren't there. Honestly, all of those work. What I do know is that Tarrare's story is the perfect example of why history is worth studying, not the sanitized version they teach in school, but the real, messy, disgusting, uncomfortable truth. Tarrare existed. He suffered. He did horrific things, either because of his condition or because of what his condition turned him into. He was exploited by everyone around him. And then he died, rotting from the inside out at 26 years old, and became a medical curiosity for centuries. That's real, that happened. And history books don't talk about it because it's too weird, too gross, too uncomfortable. But it's more interesting than any of the sanitized garbage they make you memorize for tests. History is messy, gross, and stupid. If you want the dirty truth they didn't teach you in school, hit that subscribe button for Rude History. Catch you in the next disaster.